All right, all right, all right. Thanks everybody for logging in. If you're with me at the start here, thanks for being with me. Others hopefully will join along the way. So we're live in a couple places. We're live on our website. We're live on our live.mywestside.church site. We're live on Facebook. And if you're watching in any of those ways, do me a favor right now. I would like you to go on your Facebook page and share this feed on your page, if you would, or anywhere you can. We're trying to get the word out to as many people as we can right now about what we're trying to do. So I appreciate you being here. I'm going to talk to you about the resurrection for a little bit. I'm going to be here for about maybe 25 minutes, maybe no music, nothing like that. Just want to share with you some of the thoughts on why I think the resurrection is real. Now, let me let you know also, both whether you're on live.mywestside.church or Facebook, you can type in the comments there some questions. And if I get a couple good questions or any good questions, at the end of the time, I will answer some of those live or give it a shot. And I would love to hear from you that way. So just type those in. We've got people monitoring those sites, and they'd be happy to pass those along. So let's dive in. I'm going to talk to you about the resurrection all day long at our church, and probably nearly every church across the globe today. Churches did this statement where the pastor would say, "He is risen," and everybody responds back, "He is risen indeed." Or you probably at church were walking through the hallway and somebody said, "He is risen," and you were supposed to say back, "He is risen indeed." I'll tell you a story about that. I never knew that. Growing up, we didn't do that. So I became a youth pastor after college, and I went to Maryland. And I remember, I'll never forget this, my first Easter, people coming up to me, and I was one of the pastors, and they were saying to me, "He is risen." And I'm like, yeah. I didn't know the statement, but I learned it, and regardless, people still say that. He is risen indeed. Now, here's my question. How do we know? How do we know that he is risen? Now, this is a controversial thing to say that somebody died and came back to life. As a matter of fact, I think it's the second most controversial thing in Christianity. The first most is the resurrection. The second most is, I think, the virgin birth. So I think there are two big things, but this is the most controversial thing in all of Christianity. To think that somebody died the kind of death that Jesus died, literally his body would have been gashed open, maybe his bowels even hanging out. He was really beaten to almost an inch of his life, a spear in his side, nails in his hands. As a matter of fact, the pain was so bad. Do you know they invented a word in the cross to describe the pain? The word is excruciating. That word means ex crucio, which is out of the cross. So it was a bad deal. And to think that somebody lived through all that, or after they died from that they came back to life, is kind of hard to take in. It takes a lot of faith, but it also takes some evidence. So what I want to do for the next 20 minutes or so is share with you some of the 12 points that I think, or at least for me, help me to know that I believe the resurrection is real. Some of these I've kind of learned from other people, and some of these are my own things. So 12 things I want to share with you. It'll put it on the screen here, 12 things. We'll walk them through, and I'll share with you what I think about the resurrection. Now, the first thing I want to tell you is I think the thing that gives credibility to the fact that Jesus was resurrected is that it was initially reported by women. I talked about this a little bit this morning in service, but let me rehash. So the first people to find the grave of Jesus empty were a group of women. The book of John tells us it was Mary Magdalene. Now, in that day and age, they viewed women a lot differently than we do. Now, Jesus didn't view women this way, but culture in his day did. They viewed women as unreliable and without credibility. They were not allowed to testify in court, or viewed as really naive and unworthy to be listened to. Now, Jesus didn't treat people that way, and we don't want to treat women that way either. But that's the society that they lived in. So for the early accounts, the earliest manuscripts, the earliest eyewitness accounts to say that women were the ones to make the discovery would have been controversial in itself. Because if they were lying, they would have said, well, it was a man who found. They would have just given that, they wouldn't have even given that second thought. They would have said that it was Peter or John or James. That's what they would have said. But the fact is, it was women who found the tomb empty. They just report the facts, and I like that. That gives me hope that the Bible is credible in every aspect, is because they actually just report what actually happened. They're not making up stuff. They're not embellishing. They're telling the truth what happened. So like it or not, that's what happened. So the second thing for me, and again, I got 12 of these. Number 2 is that the disciples got very bold. So when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, you really started to see the disciples cower in fear. And they were hopeless. They were fearful. They ran. You know the story of Peter. He cusses out some guys and denies Jesus 3 times, and he hightails it out of there. The only one to watch the crucifixion of Jesus was John. Everybody else had left or gone. They're fearful. Even on the very first Easter day, in the night, in the evening, when they gathered together after the resurrection, before any of them had seen Jesus, they were in the upper room, and the door was locked, and they were sitting in the dark. And so they were a fearful group of people, and I can understand that. They didn't want to be killed. They didn't want to be harmed. But after Jesus' resurrection, after they encountered them, they completely shifted from, people who were cowards or scared or fearful, as maybe anybody would be, to people who were confident and bold and fearless. And their explanation of this, you can read it in the book of Acts, is that they had actually seen face to face, flesh to flesh, Jesus Christ. And so when they were around him, that changed their fear in every way. If he can conquer death, he can conquer anything. So they were changed from fearless to or fearful to fearless. And so even think about Peter. Think about Peter. He denied Jesus 3 times, but at the end of his life, he was crucified, and he was crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified in the same way as Jesus. So he was a very bold guy, and they didn't fear Nero's lions. They didn't fear anything. They didn't even fear the church who was threatening them, or the Jewish church that was threatening them to stop preaching this truth. They'd fear nothing because they encountered the living Jesus Christ. It's funny because, like Peter, for example, when Jesus was arrested and they kept coming to Peter and saying, you know this man? He denied him. He would not talk about Jesus. But after Jesus' resurrection, he couldn't stop talking about Jesus. That's how bold he got. So here's another one. There were other witnesses. The Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 16 that there were more than 500 witnesses at one time that saw Jesus alive. Now this is fascinating because that book was written very shortly after the death of Jesus. So it's likely that all 500 of those witnesses were still alive, and you could have went and asked them. They could have been interrogated. They could have been they could have told their story as well. So there were other witnesses, more than just the 12. A lot of people were able to collaborate, and they didn't tell false stories. It's not like this, if there were 500 people telling a different story, you would hear that Jesus went fishing, or Jesus went here, or Jesus did that. But they didn't have all these conflicting stories. It was a unified story of who Jesus was and what Jesus did. Now you try it. Get 500 people to try to tell the same story. Not going to work unless it is the same story. So that's what happened. Here's another one I want to tell you about. There's one thing that the early church didn't do. Now, I don't mean the early church as in the Christianity. I mean the Jewish church. There's one thing that the Jewish religion did not do to the early church. When the resurrection happened, that's when Christianity was born. It began as a movement, and they even began by meeting in the temple. They would meet in the temple courts, and they would preach, and at first the Jewish leaders were like, yeah, whatever, but very quickly the Christian church gathered steam, and many people started following them. They stopped listening to the Jewish leaders, so they removed them from the temple, and then they tried to tell them, you can't tell this story anymore. And the Jewish leaders began to do everything they could to stop the early church from spreading the message of Jesus and who he was. Remember, the Jewish church was the ones who put Jesus to death. They were responsible for this. So, but the one thing that the early church didn't deal with from the Jewish religion is that the Jewish religion didn't say that the tomb was full. The one thing that the Jewish religion could have done to destroy the Christian church was to go to the tomb and say, here's the body of Jesus. They could have said, here he is, he's not alive, he's dead, he's right here, he's a corpse, he's rotting. They could have done that and completely destroyed the early Christian church. But they didn't do that, and the reason is because he wasn't in the grave. They quickly admitted, the Jewish religion they admitted that Jesus was not in his tomb. They even came up with the story that his body had been stolen. And even if they thought he was there, they could have gone to Joseph of Arimathea, who gave Jesus the use of his tomb, and he could have said, here's my tomb, here's where it is, here's the location, but they did not do that. That's the one thing they could have done to destroy the church, and they didn't do it. Why? Because he was not there, I believe. Here's another one. Let's talk about this fifth one here, that only Jesus has followers. Now, here's what I mean. On the cross that day, Jesus was crucified, and the Bible tells us between two other guys, criminals, thieves, thugs. We don't really know much about them, but there are two other guys, and no one today is worshiping these two other guys. Three guys died on the same day, in the same way, the same everything, the same area, the same crowd watched them, the same soldiers put them on the cross. Three guys. Only one of them, though, has followers. The other two guys, we really don't know their names. I know we ascribe names to them through historical accounts, but we really don't know what their names are. We don't know where they're from. We don't know what they look like. We really don't even know what their crimes were. We don't know much about these two guys at all. But the guy in the middle, Jesus, we know him. We follow him. We worship him. But nobody is worshiping these two other guys. Today was Easter, and we worshiped only one of those three guys. Even though they had the same encounter, the same days, those two guys, they don't get holidays. They don't get cards and songs written after them. No books are written after them. It's all about Jesus. Now think about this. When a politician loses an election for Senate, Congress, President, city clerk, whatever, when they lose, most of the time their followers, their proponents, don't stay loyal to them. Here's what happened. After Jesus died, nobody else went looking for another Messiah. It's not like he lost because he came back alive. And he won in essence. And so they remained loyal to him and not to these other two guys who died. So I find that fascinating. And there are more songs written about Jesus, more paintings dedicated to Jesus, more books written about him than any other person in history. How did this happen that only the guy in the middle gets all this and followers and the two guys on the outside did not? It's because he came back to life. That's an important thing. Let's talk about this one, that Jesus conquered Rome. Do you know Jesus conquered Rome? Let me explain this to you. So go back a week to Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday. I explained this last week in our church, that 190 years or so before Jesus died on the cross, there was another revolt that happened when the Jewish people were being oppressed by the Greeks. And a family of leaders called the Maccabees came in and they fought and they led a revolt that pushed the Greeks out, and the Jewish people were free. And so they waved palm branches when one of the Maccabee brothers, his name is Judas Maccabee, came into town, and they said, you've conquered and you're our king. And so they were celebratory. So when Jesus comes in and they're waving palm branches, they're saying, we want you to do for us like Judas Maccabee did 190 years ago, drive the Romans out, fight them out, get them out. But Jesus would not fight with the sword. There were other Messiah imposters who did, in fact, try to fight off the Romans, and every single one of them was killed. Every single one of them was slaughtered. But Jesus would not fight. He would not pick up a sword. He did not try to get an army. He didn't do any of that. And he's the one who conquered Rome. And it happened over the period of about 300 years. Jesus died, he resurrected, and a movement began of people who would love and serve and change the world. And so one at a time, they began to love the people of Rome. And Jesus said, don't fight people who are against you. Pray for those who persecute you. Love those who are after you. And so they began to do that. And it literally changed Rome. And about 300 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the Emperor Constantine declared Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman world. So it took about 300 years, but Jesus is the only Messiah who actually conquered Rome. And I find that compelling because many others tried to, but only Jesus did. And because he came alive, he was able to do that. If he was dead, if he died on the cross, a movement would not have happened. Nobody follows a loser who dies. They don't. They follow somebody who's a conqueror, who's a victor. And that's what happened with Jesus. Here's another reason. This is my seventh one out of 12, and then we'll see if there's any questions. The seventh one is this, that worship changed. Worship changed drastically. Now, today is Sunday, and we all experienced this, or most Christians did. You worship today. I know many churches will have Saturday night services or services throughout the week, and that's cool. But largely speaking, Christians worship on a Sunday. So before Jesus, Christians would worship on the Sabbath on a Saturday. It's one of the Ten Commandments. It's actually the only one of the Ten Commandments that Jesus does not affirm in the New Testament because he knows things were going to change. So they always worshiped on the Sabbath. They always did. As a matter of fact, you know this? I'll rehash something that I said this morning in my sermon, that they got up early in the morning on Friday, the day before the Sabbath, and they had a trial with Pilate because they wanted Jesus dead before sundown, because that's when the Sabbath begins, at sundown on Friday through Saturday. And they wanted Jesus to be dead because they didn't want to kill anybody on the Sabbath, which I find very ironic, because they wanted to honor a day, and in order to honor that day, they had to dishonor God himself. Fascinating that happened. Well, anyway, so the Sabbath was when Jews worshiped for centuries, literally since the beginning of time, or since the beginning of the Ten Commandments, that is. And then Jesus dies. He comes back to life on a Sunday, and that's when they have the very first worship service on that very first Sunday. You can read about it in John 20. And ever since, Christians have been meeting on the first day of the week, which is a Sunday. Now think about that, how drastic that would be. It's for them, Sunday 2,000 years ago was like our Monday. It was a work day. You worshiped on the Sabbath, and then the next day you went to work. Like for us, we worshiped today. Most everybody had today off work, and tomorrow you'll go to work. Could you imagine if we all had to shift and tomorrow start worshiping on Monday? Could you imagine how difficult that would be? We would either have to meet very early in the morning before everybody had to go to work, or at everybody's lunch break, or at evening. How hard would that be to accomplish? But that did accomplish. It changed worship. It changed the globe, so much so that literally when the founders of America were working through the American system and culture, we get 2 days off every weekend. You know, a lot of people don't get that. We get 2 days off. We get the Sabbath, which is Saturday, and the Sunday for Christianity. There's lots more to that story, but that's why every week you get Saturday and Sunday off. It literally changed the calendar and the week. It changed worship, and that's because Jesus was resurrected. That he was alive. That's how that day changed. How about this next one here? And this, just quickly, I think a good, compelling reason for the resurrection of Jesus was that his family worshiped him. Now, his family struggled to a degree with him claiming to be the Messiah. You can read about this in the book of Mark and Luke, especially, I think, where it talks about that Jesus' family thought of him as a little crazy. They weren't sure if he was representing the family right. One time they went to get him to kind of, wrangle him, and they weren't sure who he was. Even his brothers and sisters thought he was a little bit cuckoo. They weren't sure what to do with this. But after Jesus' death and after his resurrection, his family began to worship him. Mary herself prayed to him as her God and her Savior. And James, his brother, for example, wrote a book in the Bible about his brother. It's called the Book of James. As a matter of fact, next Sunday at Westside, we're going to begin verse by verse walking through the book of James. We're going to see what James has to say about his brother Jesus. James, who was a skeptic, who now is a believer in Jesus. We're going to read about that book and verse by verse and see what he has to say. It's a great book. I hope you'll be with us next Sunday as we start that. So I think that's a compelling reason that his family worshiped him. Not only that, but here's another one, that Jesus' enemies worshiped him. There were many that worshiped him that were enemies. For example, Paul. Paul's the best example. Wrote about 2/3 of the New Testament. He's a heavy hitter, intelligent dude, wrote so much so that Peter, in the book of Peter, writes that he doesn't really fully understand all that Paul's writing. He's so brilliant, he's so deep. But Paul, at the early stages of Paul's life, was killing Christians. You can read about this in the book of Acts. He wasn't just putting them in jail, he was killing them. They were martyring Christians. He was there at the first Christian killing of a guy named Stephen, and then he was trying to kill lots of people. But his life changed. He went from killing Christians to risking his own life for Jesus. And you can read about this in his books of Galatians and Philippians and Ephesians, Corinthians, Romans, all kinds of stuff that he writes about how he completely changed from killing Christians to giving his life for Jesus. That's a drastic change. You'd have to agree that that's a drastic change. What would compel someone to do that? Here's what Paul said. He changed because he met in person Jesus on the Damascus Road. Again, you can read about that in the book of Acts. He came face to face with the real, live, breathing, in the flesh Jesus. And that changed everything. And I don't blame them, because that would change you if you were to encounter Jesus in the flesh. That would change anybody. That's what happened to Paul. I got a couple more. Here's my 10th one out of 12, and then we'll see if we got any questions. The disciples were not gullible. I think that's also a compelling reason for the resurrection of Jesus. So every one of us, we're constantly deciding whether to believe people or not. You work with people, some of them you believe, some of them you trust, some you don't. You go to church with people, some you trust, some you don't. You've got to determine whether you trust a pastor or a policeman or politicians or anybody. How do we know who to trust? I know to trust my wife. She's trustworthy. I listen to her. But there are other people in my life who I don't trust. You have the same circumstance. So what about the disciples? What about these 12 disciples? They were the first ones to write down this story and to record it. They were the first eyewitnesses to tell it and spread it. Are they credible? That's the question. Are they credible? First, let me say this. They were not quick to accept the resurrection. If you read again in John, Mary Magdalene, for example, gets to the tomb and it's empty. The stone is rolled away, and she kind of has a freak out moment that he's not there, and she's crying. What happened? She didn't see an empty tomb and just go in a very gullible sense, oh, he must be back to life. That was not her first thought. And if you go by a cemetery today and they've dug out a grave and they're getting ready to have a funeral, your first thought is, hey, somebody came out of that grave. That's not your thought. You're not gullible either. They were not gullible. It wasn't their first inclination was that he's back to life. Their first inclination was that he was stolen or that he was moved. So they weren't just gullible to believe something silly to begin with. Like Thomas, who Thomas said, I'm not going to believe that Jesus is alive till I can touch his hands and see the wound in his side. He wanted evidence and proof. And a little bit of skepticism is good for all of us. And the disciples have that. But they yet write a lot of the books in the New Testament. The Gospels and some of the epistles and the book of Revelation, their stories are all throughout the New Testament. The book of Acts is all about them. And their content is not written from a gullible group of people. It is rich, it is deep, it is profound, it is coherent. These are not the words of gullible, dumb men. They are telling profound truths and mysteries of God that come from deep wisdom and insight. So I don't believe that those kind of guys who can write that sort of deep, coherent, logical, loving gospel message as given to them by God will be so gullible to believe a silly story. That's not the case. You find occasional gullible people, sure, but a group of them, no, they were intelligent guys. They were clearly not gullible. Here's another one, and this is really quick. I think the fact that Christianity has exploded is evidence for Jesus' resurrection. There's not just a few people who believe in this. There are billions of people who believe in this all across the planet. There are probably, I don't know the statistics, but I'm sure a good, healthy percentage of the globe worshiped Jesus today. Maybe 50%, I don't know, but a lot of people on the globe worship Jesus, and throughout time there have been billions of people who believe in Jesus. Not everybody has. Agreed, not everybody has, but billions have. It's exploded from a group of 12 disciples to a global movement. That many people, I don't think that many people can be wrong. So there's some truth to knowing that many people who believe in Jesus, there's something to be said. Now my last point, it's kind of probably my favorite. It's not the most important, but one of my favorite is, where's the tomb? I love this. Where is the tomb? We have no idea where Jesus' tomb is. Now that's unique because every one of us knows people who have died, and if they've been buried in a cemetery, we know very quickly where their tomb is. You can go to the grave and we put head markers there, or we can put, or some of you may have urns that you put on mantle places, and so we know where people are, we know where they're at, but we have no idea where Jesus' tomb is. It was never enshrined. Even now when somebody dies, you'll be riding down the side of the road and you'll see one of those crosses on the side of the road with flowers because we enshrine or entomb the exact place where they died, but that did not happen with Jesus. So there are four major religions in the world: Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity. Those are the four major. I know there's more, but those are the four major. Three of those four have a sacred place where their founder is buried. And they make pilgrimages there, and people go there and they weep and they wail and they cry and they put flowers and they burn incense and do all sorts of things, and they, buy little snow globes that shake, or whatever they do, and the little spoon they hang on the wall. They go there. Only 3 have them out of the 4. Jewish religion, they follow Abraham, and it's in our Bible. Wonderful, wonderful guy, and those are our friends. His tomb is in Hebron. That's where his tomb is, and you can go there today. His followers go there, and they remember their leader who is there. His bones, his body is there. Then you've got Buddhism. Buddha is buried in Kushingar, India. That's where he is. There's a shrine there to him, and his followers, again, they go there, and you can cry and weep and see the tomb and think and wish that Buddha was alive, but he's not. He's dead. He's buried right there in Kushingar. Then you've got Islam. Muhammad is buried in Medina, India. He's right there. Again, his followers go there and they see the tomb and they bring flowers and they offer up prayers or whatever they do and hope and they remember their leader, but he's dead and he's there and he's buried. The only world religion that doesn't have that is Christianity. Do you know who's buried in Abraham's tomb? Abraham. Do you know who's buried in Buddha's tomb? Buddha. Do you know who's buried in Muhammad's tomb? Muhammad. Do you know who's buried in Jesus' tomb? Nobody. We don't even know where his tomb is. And the reason is because when Jesus was alive, or Jesus came back to life, people didn't feel the need to go to his grave to put flowers out. They didn't go there to weep. They didn't go there to wail. They didn't go there to burn incense or pray. Why would you go to a grave where nobody is when Jesus is over here? You could just go kind of talk with Jesus. And so that's what they did. They encountered Jesus, and then this movement spread that so quickly that they quickly forgot which grave he was buried in because nobody was going there. That's the case. They knew where he was buried. For example, the soldiers knew, Joseph of Arimathea knew, Nicodemus knew, Pilate knew, the early church knew, the church leaders knew, the women who found him in the morning, they knew, but they stopped going there. And the word didn't get passed on because it wasn't necessary to go there. So that's the case. So we're not Muslims, we're not Jews, we're not Buddhists, we're Christians, and we follow a man who's alive. So thanks for watching. Those are my 12 points about what I think about the resurrection. I'm sure you've got lots more to say about that. If you want to know more or after you watch this, you can post online some questions or you can text to me. My number is 317-956-0375. Thanks for watching. Thanks for taking time out of your Sunday evening here to hear what I have to say about the resurrection. It means a lot to me that you've been here. It means a lot that you've listened. It's important to me that, well, I've given my life to this, so I want to know that it's true. And I think you want to know the same thing. Is it true that Jesus was resurrected? I believe so. I believe it changes their life. So have a wonderful Easter night and a wonderful week. And don't forget, He is risen. He is risen indeed. Thanks for watching.